All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive production document for a massive 10-part historical documentary series called Continental Footprint. It's an absolutely fascinating look at how a localized guerrilla force totally transformed into one of Africa's primary security providers over the course of 30 years. We're talking decades of foreign interventions and intense military diplomacy.
Here is our agenda for today. A continental military footprint, the early interventions, Liberia fighting for peace, the Buchanan deployment, expanding the operations, and finally, the evolution of the UPDF.
Section 1. A Continental Military Footprint, mapping 30 years of operations.
This 10-part series covers an incredible historical sweep. We're tracking an evolution that literally starts back in the 1970s with Idi Amin and those early Cold War alliances. Then, it moves through some really complex regional dynamics, like the roots of the Rwandan Patriotic Front in the Ugandan Bush War, and their later clashes in Kisangani during the Great War of Africa. And it goes all the way up to modern, intense urban warfare against al-Shabaab in Somalia. The documentary organizes all of this into a super strict chronological and thematic framework, which is exactly what we'll use to guide us today.
Section 2. The early interventions, Cold War, and regional clashes.
So the stage was really set by Uganda's early external posture. The source documents note that back in 1972, Idi Amin expelled Israeli military advisors and made a hard pivot toward Muammar Gaddafi's Libya for financial aid and military hardware. Well, that directly fueled the fire of 1976 when an Air France flight was hijacked and redirected to Entebbe, with Amin acting as the host sponsor. That massive international crisis ended in the famous Israeli commando raid that literally destroyed Uganda's MiG fighter fleet right on the tarmac. Fast forward to 1979, the regime is facing total collapse, and Libyan commandos were actually deployed to places like Lukaya and Entebbe to defend Amin against advancing Tanzanian forces.
Section 3. Liberia, fighting for peace, the 1994 ECOMOG deployment.
The documentary script hits us with this incredibly powerful reality right from the jump. It introduces this fundamental dilemma that about 900 Ugandan troops faced in 1994. They deployed as peacekeepers under a multinational force called ECOMOG. But they very quickly realized that enforcing a peace mandate in a totally fragmented, active war zone is a completely different ballgame than traditional observing.
To really grasp what they walked into, we have to look at the forces on the ground. On one hand, you had UNMIL, your conventional United Nations observer mission, mostly just trying to monitor a political transition after the 1993 Cotonou Agreement. But on the other hand, you had ECOMOG. Led primarily by Nigeria and heavily backed by these newly arrived Ugandan troops, ECOMOG was a regional enforcement mission. It was sent in to be the actual operational muscle, to force security into existence on the ground.
And the odds they faced? Staggering. Imagine roughly 50,000 heavily armed fighters scattered across various factions in Liberia, including the NPFL and the Liberian Peace Council. Yet, despite ECOMOG being there, by late 1994, fewer than 3,000 of those fighters had actually been disarmed. The disarmament process was practically dead in the water, leaving civilians completely trapped between heavily armed hostile factions.
Section 4. The Buchanan deployment, protecting civilians at the SOS village. This brings us to a vital question the documentary raises. How in the world do you keep a peace that literally does not exist? When local factions look at your military presence not as some neutral referee, but as a direct threat to their territory, how do you actually fulfill a peaceful mandate?
Well, the answer was a rapid, intense shift to tactical combat operations. In March 1994, the Liberian Peace Council launched attacks that pushed hundreds of fleeing civilians, and even some disarmed fighters, straight toward the SOS village near Buchanan, right where the Ugandan forces were stationed. These troops had to flip a switch from peacekeepers to active combatants in an instant. The source details how they had to set up immediate defensive perimeters, fight off ambushes, and engage in actual combat just to create safety zones for those non-combatants. They were, quite literally, fighting for peace.
Section 5. Expanding the operations from the Congo to Somalia and beyond.
Building on those hard-learned lessons from Buchanan, the series maps out a massive expansion of operations over the following years. We see deployments in the Democratic Republic of Congo focused on securing borders and anti-ADF operations. We see long-range jungle tracking in the Central African Republic from 2009 to 2017, where specialized Ugandan units actually teamed up with U.S. military advisors to hunt down Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. And then in 2013, they're securing the capital city of Juba in South Sudan to prevent government collapse and evacuate tens of thousands of East African civilians.
What's really fascinating here is their transformation into high-risk first responders. Breaking down Episode 6, the documentary shows that in March 2007, Uganda was the absolute first nation to deploy troops to Mogadishu under the African Union Mission in Somalia, or AMISOM. They went in when literally no one else would, eventually fighting through intense urban warfare to clear key districts, like the Bakara Market and Mogadishu Stadium, from al-Shabaab control.
But it wasn't always just boots on the ground. And the documentary impartially reports on their diplomatic maneuvers as well. During the 2011 Libya crisis, President Museveni coordinated directly with South African President Jacob Zuma through the African Union High-Level Panel. They pushed hard for a negotiated political solution and an African Union military footprint, which was in direct opposition to NATO's regime change strategy in Tripoli.
Section 6. Evolution of the UPDF, the Strategic Transformation.
All of this historical groundwork culminates in what the series calls the doctrine of Pan-African security. Think about this. We are looking at a military force that started as the National Resistance Army, fighting a bush war in the Luwero Triangle in the 1980s. They then transformed into the highly professionalized Uganda People's Defense Forces. That underlying political philosophy is what drove their evolution into one of the continent's primary security exporters.
And that brings us right back to where we started this deep dive. The source material is crystal clear. The raw, grueling lessons from Buchanan built the foundation for 30 years of expeditionary warfare. Liberia proved, without a doubt, that you cannot step into a failing state without high combat readiness. That exact lesson directly shaped the survival tactics and doctrines they would rely on in places like Somalia well over a decade later.
So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought, drawn right from the core of this documentary series. As regional forces increasingly take on these complex enforcement missions, when the mandate is peace but the reality is active combat, where does the line between keeping the peace and fighting the war truly lie? It really challenges us to rethink what actual security demands on the ground. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you learn.